Welcome to the Governance Podcast at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name is Mark Pennington. I'm the director of the centre, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Barry Weingast, who is the Ward C. Krebs Family Professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, where he's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Professor Weingast served as chair of the Department of Political Science from 1996 to 2001. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Barry's work focuses on the political foundation of markets, economic reform and regulation, where he's made path-breaking contributions to problems of political economy of development, federalism and decentralization, legal institutions, the rule of law and democracy. Barry, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here today. I'd like to start, if I may, by asking you a question which is very close to the heart of the Centre's mission. And that's to think about the age-old question of why some countries are rich and others are poor. Your answer to that question is that poor countries are stuck in what you call the violence trap. I wonder whether you could tell us what you mean by the violence trap and how your explanation for the persistence of poverty differs from some of the other explanations that have been heard in political economy.
All right, so you've asked two questions, so let's parse them, deal with them separately. The first has to do with what the violence trap is, and the second has to do with how does the violence trap differ as an explanation from alternatives. Both good questions. The violence trap is the idea that violence is endemic in the world and that all countries have to solve the problem of violence. That violence needs to be mitigated. It's not something that's naturally goes away. And so countries that face problems of violence have trouble developing because the main way that developing countries mitigate or solve the problem of violence is by creating rents and privileges through control of markets, control and manipulation of markets. And so basically the idea is that most developing countries have multiple sources of violence. The state has no monopoly on violence. And as a consequence, people with violence power have to be appeased in order for them to cooperate, which means that they have to believe that they're better off cooperating than they would be were they to exercise violence. And so that's what creates the trap. The main way in which developing countries mitigate violence has to do with control of markets, and control of markets means you don't have competitive economies. You have to control, in order to create privilege, you have to control markets and manipulate them in ways that forestall the value of market competition. And so it's kind of a trap.
So the very things that prevent efficiency are the things that are required to actually stop violence from taking place or reducing the amount of violence.
Yes, exactly.
That's quite a bleak view in many ways.
It is, but it also reflects the fact that despite 50 years of donor organizations spending trillions of dollars on development, that there hasn't been a lot of development since then. And, that's something that's, I think, is not an accident.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say this explanation focusing on the violence trap, the idea that inefficiencies almost are required to stop violence or reduce violence, how does that explanation of persistent poverty differ from some of the other explanations that we see in political economy? There are many sort of institutionally grounded explanations for poverty. How does your explanation differ from that, or how does it complement those?
I think it complements a good many of the alternative explanations. There are several that have been popular over the years. One of the first had to do with the idea of capital, that poor countries were poor because they had less of what the developing countries had, in particular less capital. And so then the policy recommendation was to provide capital, which didn't seem to make much of a difference. So people looked at other kinds of variables, such as human capital and education. So the idea is, then the policy consequence is you increase the amount of education. That also didn't seem to work. Another one is the idea of good governance, which was popular in the late 90s and early aughts. The idea that you needed good institutions and institutions of the right kind, such as courts that would enforce contracts and secure property rights. That turned out not to work very well either. So there are lots of alternatives, and I think part of the reason they failed is because of the nature of violence, that they ignore the problem of violence, and that economists, when they look at the problem of developing countries, they see the manipulation of markets, which the violence trap agrees that's a major problem. But the difference is that economists tend to see it as very unproductive. It gets in the way. It's market intervention. It's as if there was a market that was then controlled. First there was a market and then it was controlled. Whereas in reality, what's happening is there never was a market. Instead, there's only.
So this is the process that you refer to as rent creation.
Yes.
Which is the idea of distributing privileges which are actually necessary to reduce the amount of violence, to maintain something like a reasonably peaceful state.
Yeah.
But paradoxically, the effect of these mechanisms, although they suppress the violence, they also block efficiency-enhancing moves.
Yeah.
So, given how bleak a prognosis that is,
mm-hmm.
how can people escape from this? Is there any mechanism through which people escape from the violence trap?
Well, I think that over time, if we go back to early modern times, you think about most countries in Europe were developing countries, and so they've managed to develop, and so clearly they've escaped the violence trap. Of course, it's taken a long time, several centuries. Mary Shirley, once a former economist at the World Bank, asked a question: does that mean that developing countries also need 200 years to develop? And John Wallace, an economic historian at the University of Maryland, has a paper called the Mary Shirley question, naming the question that she asks. And he grapples with this and suggests it's not quite true. But, and we can observe in the few cases of development, such as China, Taiwan, South Korea, that in a couple of generations you can make quite fast progress.
Just to go back to the previous point, I think there's a very interesting parallel between your argument about rent creation and the way some economists view these problems, with lots of scholars of sort of institutional economics who emphasize the idea that they react against rather the notion that in the beginning there are markets. Mm. And they actually start from the beginning, and your starting point effectively is in the beginning there is violence. What can be done to move beyond violence? Mm-hmm. And that is a very different type of analysis. Mm-hmm. Why do you think economists are resistant to that as a form of analysis, or have been resistant to it?
Well, I think one of the things that is not realized is that so much of economics has been developed through observations of developed societies. The UK and the United States, for example. So many economists develop the whole apparatus of policy analysis, welfare economics, and various subfields, largely been developed through the study of developed economies. And that sort of holds content for this. I think the fiction of market intervention, works for the developed countries because there are markets, and part of what we see is the political manipulation of markets, which you can think of as market intervention. But I think in developing countries where there are no markets or much more manipulated markets, I think the fiction is not very useful. I should say I call that the neoclassical fallacy.
Yeah, but I guess the implication of that would be that before today's developed countries achieve their current state, that the market intervention paradigm, as you describe it, wouldn't have been useful to describing how they developed as well.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to recognize, as most economists do these days, that property rights, enforcement of property rights, and contracts is really central. And then it's another to understand, well, how does the developed world provide those? And how do you create a court system that actually works for justice as opposed to as a bribing mechanism that extract rents from people that need to resolve conflicts?
So in many ways, this is an argument against any view that that markets are a natural phenomena.
Yeah.
It's an argument that markets have to be sustained within certain institutional conditions.
Yes.
But whether you actually get to those institutional conditions is the big question.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think this goes back to Adam Smith, who I think understood this and talked much about the simultaneous rise of liberty at the same time as markets. That you need the idea of provision of rights and restrictions on the predatory power of the state. So I think what's natural in his view is the tendency to truck barter and exchange. What's not natural is markets as the main means of that. That doesn't mean market forces are absent. They're there all the time. It's just that so many political systems control and manipulate the nature of markets and exchange processes.
Yeah. So, I mean, an interesting implication of this argument would be, if we're thinking in policy terms, what can be done, if anything, to help societies out of the violence trap? I mean, I know something you said to us in one of the presentations that you've given here in the department earlier in the week was the notion that many World Bank interventions, for example, have been premised on the idea of this market intervention view, yes, where the aim of policy should be to remove distortions in the developing world, when what your argument is suggesting is that actually, if you try to remove those distortions, you might actually intensify the process of violence. Could you give a few examples of where you think that's happened? And also, perhaps we could go on to think then about what would be an alternative policy approach that can actually deal with this problem, that it's about rent creation.
I'm not sure I can give a great example of that. I think that there are lots of... So Kenya is a really interesting example. Kenya in the late aughts. So our book, my book with Doug North and John Wallace on the violence and the social orders, came out in 2009. And as part of the process of writing it, we aired it at the World Bank, in which someone was saying, this was in November of 2008, I believe, or 2007. I'm mixing up what year the election was in Kenya. But it said, but Kenya is making such great strides. It's an open access order. There's competition in markets. There's the ability to form organizations. And Doug North answered by saying, just wait. This won't last. And sure enough, at the end of the year, the beginning of the next year, when there was an election, the incumbent party saw that it would lose and tried to cancel the elections and wouldn't step down, knowing that it had in effect lost. And part of the reason has to do with the stakes of politics were really big under that, and there was no what we call perpetuity of the institutions. Perpetuity is the idea that institutions last beyond the people that actually create them. And so the incumbents felt they would lose so much by transferring the property that was managed by the government, which they managed to their own private ends, would be transferred to the opposition.
Yeah. I mean, it's not all, as I understand your argument, it's not only that that markets are not natural phenomena as such. Yeah. It's also that democracy isn't a natural institution either. So if we have to think about steps to building markets or building democracy, what will be the steps in the case of democracy that could be taken in places where it doesn't currently exist?
Well, I think one of the important things to understand about democracy is that it is not wholly positive. That is, democracy imposes risks. It allows the government to jail people, to impose taxes, and even when these things are not abused, they can be very costly. And so one of the characteristics of successful democracies, I think, has to do with the idea that all successful ones reduce the stakes of power. And the reason for this is Chile in 1973. That is, when the legitimately elected government, the Allende government, started threatening landholders with major land reforms, which effectively would confiscate their wealth, the landlords, were willing to support a coup. And a coup was disastrous for the society at the time. And that's why I think all constitutions need to limit the stakes of power. Whereas in the modern world, there's a tendency to identify democracy with elections. And elections alone are very high stakes, because if there's no boundaries on what the government can do, then you can take immense amounts in very legitimate or at least legal ways from other constituents. And those constituents are not willing to stand by the wayside often. They'd rather fight. And so as a consequence, successful democracies have to limit the stakes. And there's a lack of understanding, I think, of that very basic principle.
But is there anything that external bodies could do to promote a better understanding of that? Or what kind of policies might flow that are different from the ones that we've seen that would be informed by that insight?
Well, that's actually a multiple part question, because you ask both what kinds of policies toward democracy would make a difference for successful democracy, as well as what kinds of policies would be, what does the violence trap framework suggest as to what the policies for development should be?
Yeah.
So let's address each of those in sequence.
Yeah.
So the first question having to do with the democracy is to realize that democracy and liberalism are two separate parts that are very complementary. The idea that creating liberty and rights of citizens, which means you need to create something of a limited government. Now, let me be clear about limited government, because in modern parlance, that's often used by conservatives to mean small government. I don't use the term that way. Limit on government means that governments can honor rights of citizens, which is a constraint on their behavior. And so that's what limited government means. And creating the aspect of limited government, I think, is a really important part of the democratization process. And you can watch historically in Western Europe that all the democracies began with lots of restrictions on choice, but nonetheless went and grew into more mature democracies. You can see the same thing in Taiwan and Korea, for example. So that's the answer to the question with respect to democracy. With respect to development policy, that's a very interesting point. So the idea has to be, I think, that you have to acknowledge the role of violence and the role of rent creation as a means of mitigating violence, that these are not unproductive, simply interest group and constituency pressure that forces politics to transform markets or market intervention. Rather, I think, and so this framework suggests that we focus on some of the elements of escaping the violence trap, which involve things like creating impersonal markets, impersonality, and rule of law, which involves both impersonality and perpetuity.
I think an interesting question is, are external agencies actually in a very good position to foster those policies? So I wonder, how do you react to, say, the William Easterly style view, which is pretty much that there's not a lot that external agencies can do, that they don't know enough about the conditions on the ground in many of these societies to intervene, whether it's through state building or development aid or other mechanisms to bring about the appropriate transitions. I guess an implication of his argument would be maybe even the kind of things that you're recommending. Would officials know, external officials know how to implement the right policies in the right cultural setting? How do you react to that?
I think there's a lot to that, and that we need to face the fact that it might be true. That it may be that despite best intentions, we really don't know what we're doing. And I think one of the interesting things about this is we've managed, in the developed world, we've managed to develop without really knowing how we did it. I don't think there's a deep understanding of this, and especially the way in which politics has to interact in a systematic way with, markets in a way that fosters growth over the long term.
Well, there's the way you emphasize the role of ignorance there. I mean, the lecture that you gave for us yesterday evening on Adam Smith's theory of organized religion focused very much on the role of unintended consequences in Smith's thought system. And the example that you gave there was that the sort of dysfunctional equilibrium that existed with a standoff between secular lords and religious authorities kept much of Europe in something like a poverty trap for many centuries. But then, almost by accident, through decisions that were made, you had the growth of cities, which provided a counterpoint to that. And the churches initially took decisions which promoted the cities. and they didn't recognize that an effect of that would be ultimately an undermining of their own power.
Yes.
That's very much an unintended consequences
Mhm.
explanation. It's also a sort of accident byproduct type view of history that many people, even if they accept it, find, to use a term I used earlier in the conversation, quite bleak in the sense that it doesn't seem to be something that we can program or plan for or design policy for. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the position?
Well, that's a very pessimistic. I'm a little more optimistic than that, and I think that we can learn, from the past and current mistakes in ways that we can understand, I think, some of the heart of the issues. So, for example, one of the key things I think that mitigates violence in the developed world is market integration. It's the idea that we are very highly specialized, and there's lots of specialized investments where I depend on you and you depend on me, as well as others. And by integration means that were we to fight, the cost of disruption would be very high. And so it makes it much less likely that people will appeal to violence. And I think fostering market integration, I think, is maybe a key piece of this in terms of maintaining peace. So, but to think more broadly, one of the things we don't know is we haven't tried policies that directly aim at violence in the sense of how do we lower the probability of violence, raise the costs. I think the idea of taking a war-torn country and one of the first things you do as far as reform is create democracy, where democracy means elections, I think is very counterproductive because the stakes are so high that violence is likely to emerge, as in the case of Kenya.
But what would be an example of a sort of democracy promoting policy that isn't just focused on elections? Would that be something that is focused on constitutional settlement more broadly, that tries to bring in a number of different parties, but without a focus on whoever is going to be winning a majority at the next election? What would be the kind of mechanism there that is different if you don't just focus on elections?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the role of constitutions and a constitutional base, and I think that that's a very critical piece of it. And part of what that means is again the idea of limited government. That is, reducing the stakes of democracy so that people are less likely to fight if they find themselves on the losing end. And another thing is making the situation. One of the things we see in all successful constitutions is the idea of the consensus condition, the idea that there's a relatively widespread belief that this is a good system, and systems that solve problems in the beginning, such as follow war-torn areas, that actually help mitigate violence from reemerging, are often become to have normative value in the society, in the sense that people think these are good institutions, they solve problem of violence. And I think we see in lots of different revolutions that create successful constitutions that they have this property.
I mean, that's an interesting question there, thinking about what is the role of beliefs or moral attitudes in your framework. Mm-hmm. So we're operating here in a world where the analysis is focusing on the idea that there are potentially warring factions that might try to seize control at the expense of the other. And we're trying to think about mechanisms that might reduce their propensity to do that. Do you have a role in there for something that is separate from material interests, a sort of role of belief systems, ideologies, ethics, that actually transform the way that people see the games that they're actually playing with others? And what would be that mechanism?
Well, I think that's a really important case. So one way to think about this is to think about post-Franco Spain. So Franco takes over in a coup and civil war in the 1930s. And in 1939, he's the winner of the civil war between the Republicans and more conservative faction in society. And he remains the dictator for 40 years, 40 some odd years, dies in 1975. And during the Franco regime, there were two different separate narratives about what happened in the Civil War. And both sides blamed the other for being the bad guys. And Republicans, that lost the war said, that they suffered at the hands of the Franco regime, or Franco army and regime, and the conservatives said that the socialist government was a threat to society, and the foundations of society, the church, the military, for example, and the peasantry. And so the two were two conflicting narratives. And after Franco dies, there's an attempt at creating a new constitution in Spain. And this guy Suarez is one of the leaders who's managing the transition. He's a brilliant set of moves. And one of the first things he does is to transform the nature of the narrative. The narrative was not that one side killed the other, but rather that brother fought brother, and that both sides had a lot to blame, and that we should think of this not as one side doing something to the other side, but as a national tragedy that we should try and make so it doesn't ever happen again.
I mean, that's very interesting, because that implies to me a role for something like a conception of political entrepreneurship, that political entrepreneurs, skillful entrepreneurs, or constitution builders are people who can change other people's perceptions of the nature of the game that's actually being played.
Very much so, yes.
So that people don't just seem stuck in a trap. But that needs someone who's inside the system somehow to step outside of it and create a set of ideas that those parties who are still within the system can somehow subscribe to. I mean, would you agree that that's what entrepreneurs, or the role that they can, or would hope they would play in politics?
Yes. And that's what makes it so difficult, because just because there's a role for one doesn't mean one will emerge.
No.
But one of the things we do see, so Jan Elster has written about constitutions for several decades, and one of the points he makes in a 2000 essay is that so many of the stable constitutions that exist today, that have been long-term, multi-generation, are those that were created in crisis. And I think crisis is really important, because there are lots of gains from cooperation to be had, and it's not a zero-sum game. And a lot of the successful constitutions are created in those, and when they actually solve problems, they often become venerated. And I think that's a really important thing, as is the articulation of the nature of the problem and the nature of the solution by the political entrepreneurs.
Do you see any implications, I mean, what we've just been talking about, for some contemporary events and contemporary developments? So we've just been emphasizing in the last few minutes the idea of people changing perceptions so that they see that there are possibly mutual gains from cooperation that they hadn't seen before. In today's world, there's an awful lot of us versus them kind of thinking, which seems to be creating a narrative which, if it were to persist in the long term, you could see leading to a breakdown of cooperation, because people would start to see themselves in permanently zero-sum or even negative-sum situations. Obviously the examples that I'm thinking of might be the President of the United States emphasizing restrictions on trade, that the rest of the world is a threat to the United States rather than a partner in some kind of mutually beneficial enterprise. So how do you see that at the moment? What do you think is the cause of that?
Well, you asked several different questions, and let me see if I can address some of them. I think you're right to point out that polarization is potentially dangerous. And the reason is again, the consensus condition, the idea that when people have similar beliefs and react in concert, they can prevent various kinds of problems created by the government, various kinds of predation and discrimination. And that's very critical. And when you see the emergence of polarization, it makes it much harder for people to perceive that there's a middle ground, that there's a compromise. And when the society actually is composed of people that believe in good guys and bad guys, and all the people that are on one side think they're the good side and the other side's the bad side, and vice versa, that can be very dangerous. And it's very hard to sustain limited government under these circumstances, because people believe that the other side is illegitimate. And that's very dangerous.
So, I mean, is there anything that your framework suggests might be deployed to try to get out of that, to reverse that dynamic, if that's what is setting in at the moment? Or are we just going back to what we were saying before, that you actually need new entrepreneurs to come in and try to offer a more positive vision of what can actually be achieved?
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. New visionaries are really critical in politics. And they create different visions of the way the world works and different policy solutions. I think the 30s is an example of that. Franklin Roosevelt in the United States was very important for creating the nature of the narrative about what happened, what the problem is, and what the solution was.
Just building on that a little bit, I wonder whether you might reflect on some of your earlier work on the notion of market-preserving federalism.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, that's really part of a package of what you described as limited government,
yes,
where people commit to a set of institutions that constrain the government in some way, in the sense that there are competing units at a relatively decentralized level, and that those preserve markets in many ways, partly because they are a sort of market, that people can move to the jurisdictions that are offering better protections for property rights. How do you explain, or is there an explanation for the current move that there seems to be in America, but all in many other parts of the world since the financial crisis, that seems to be very skeptical of markets? How do you interpret those trends?
Well, again, you asked two questions. You asked about market-preserving federalism as a phenomenon, and then a question about, the trend away from markets. So I think I have more to say about the former than the latter. As far as the former goes, with market-preserving federalism, I think a very instructive case is China. So China, a lot of people that study China say that China has had no political reform. And that's in part because what they focus on is the authoritarian nature of the Communist Party and the idea that there's no elections and there's no movement, no movement toward elections, and indeed a very authoritarian stamping out of pro-democratic movements. And so I think that this perspective is wrong, the idea there's been no political reform, because political reform is more than just democracy. Authoritarians rarely choose mechanisms that limit their power. And part of what happened in the early phase of reform in the early 1980s was the creation of a federal system that decentralized authority over the economy from the central government to the local governments, the provinces in particular. And Guangdong was allowed to move one step ahead in reform. And that was very important, I think, for the demonstration effect. So, for example, one of the things that occurred was there was a bowl of, I think, 636 or 363, I think 636 different items that peasants typically used that had ceilings on the prices. And so one of the first things that Guangdong does is remove the price caps. And initially the prices rise because these were real constraints. And so people thought that's bad. But what they created was the nature of markets, and that in combination with agrarian reform meant that private people started producing food for Guangdong, and as that supply side reaction became strong enough, the prices actually fell below the market prices in Guangdong actually fell below the subsidized level. And one of the things that occurred in this province way up in the north near Korea, Heilongjiang, was that the finance minister committed and the government committed to the existing system of subsidies and increased the subsidies, which meant they needed to find revenue for that. And the finance minister is watching Guangdong, and once Guangdong's prices fall below the original subsidy rate, he says, why should we be propping up this system when if we move to markets, the prices will fall in a way that doesn't require us to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so that's the nature of competition.
I mean, that's another example that goes back to the earlier conversation. What seems to have happened in China is almost a sort of an unintended consequence of events that took place, leading to the spread of markets through this kind of mechanism. It doesn't seem to have been something that was planned as such. Yeah. It seems to have emerged from accidents. I mean, I know some people place a lot of emphasis on the role of the Cultural Revolution having created chaos, which allowed decentralized
Yes.
islands of authority to rise
Mm-hmm.
up, which could do different things.
Yes.
And then the successful experiments started to ripple out. That's another one of those accidental sort of stories.
Yes. I think nobody knows in 1981 whether or not this will
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
And it's important to have chosen Guangdong because they're historically the most market-oriented and
Yeah.
the most likely experiment to succeed.
Yeah.
And it succeeds beyond anybody's dream. And the decentralization process means that because there's so much development over the next decade, it means the provinces become economic powerhouses and are much more flush with revenue than is the central government. So the central government sort of dismantles this system of market-preserving federalism in the early 90s.
I mean, this is the reason I did ask the questions together, thinking about current attitudes to markets, because if market-preserving federalism, the kind of institutions that to some extent are reflected in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps in other parts of the developed world, have the properties that you suggest, that they're kind of self-sustaining constitution. They're required for good results, but those good results sort of generate their own internal support mechanisms. How do we explain these situations where you seem to get a decline in support almost for that constitutional settlement? And that does seem to be something that is happening at the moment in Europe and in the United States.
Well, I think one of the important things is that we need to understand that markets have to be sustained, and it's not automatic. And this is, again, part of the neoclassical fallacy, which just presumes that we have stable democratic and markets. And that, the whole debate about the asymmetries in the income process means that a lot of people in the bottom half feel that they're being left out. And when they feel they're being left out, there's no support for the market. And so one of the key things I think about is that the market has to be sustained. And in particular, I think that part of the way in which the West has done it is through various forms of social insurance. It's often called welfare and thought of as redistributive, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. That's, again, this neoclassical fallacy. There exist markets, you get intervention. If you realize we have to sustain markets, and that if people don't feel they have a stake in the success of if people feel they don't have a stake in the success of markets, then they're going to support populism and other anti-market kinds of policies. And so it's really critical, I think, to reduce the idiosyncratic risk of markets, which is what social insurance policies do.
So there's a role for social insurance very much within this limited government notion. It's part of a sort of constitutional settlement. So, I mean, again, going back to the earlier conversation, actually using the term social insurance as part of a narrative sounds very different to speaking of welfare. I mean, do you think there is a role there for language in thinking about how these notions are actually effectively marketed to people? If you use a term like social insurance, a much more positive notion, a more inclusive notion than the idea of welfare. That there are some people who pay out and others people who take the benefits.
And so much, there are welfare programs that are redistributed, such as, in the United States, food. To families with dependent children, for example. But I think a lot of the important social insurance programs, such as unemployment insurance, basically there's a pool of people that pay in, and they're the people that are eligible for the benefits. And so that looks much more like an insurance scheme, because the people that are paying in are also the beneficiaries.
So I wonder whether you could just to wrap up, maybe you could let us know, what are your future projects? I mean, are you just going to be carrying on now working on the violence and social orders work, which is a huge agenda? There are so many different aspects to your work. What are you going to be working on next?
Well, I'm hopefully finishing a book on Adam Smith's politics, which I talked about last night in the public lecture. So that's one. But another thing that I've started to worry about is how do we know what works? And so part of what we've been talking about is epistemic problems. Like, how do you know some things that might help poverty reduction and economic development.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting is looking over from early modern Europe on, where people were trying to understand how the world worked and how you can make it a better place. So Hobbes, for example, says at the end of the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century, says that you can't divide power. The best you can do is create a system of authority, an authoritarian government, because to do anything else risks civil war. And so the idea is that security is the best you can do, even if the government is rapacious. You're better off with that than fighting another civil war. And so that sort of creates what I call, working with Josh Ober, classicist and political scientist at Stanford. And I've been working on this, is the Hobbes challenge. The idea, if you're going to create a system of limited government that has divided powers, you have to have an argument of why it can be sustained. That is, why it's self-enforcing. And so we can look from a lot of the major people that are thought of now as philosophers. So Hobbes and Harrington answering Hobbes a few years later, John Locke writing at the end of the 17th century, David Hume in the early part of the 18th century, Montesquieu in France, Adam Smith and then James Madison. Part of what they're doing is they're learning from each other, and they're figuring out what the problems are in the world, and they're coming up with solutions. And if you look at the evolution of the solutions that they propose, you can see they're trying to address Hobbes' challenge. How do you make it work? And one of the things that Madison and the founders in America are often criticized for creating this system of checks and balances that really was very anti-democratic. And that's, in a way, an anachronistic interpretation, because it's reading back what we know now into history. Whereas now we know that you can support in developed world stable constitutional democracy. But in 1787, nobody knew if it could be done. And, but it turns out that the speculation in the series of people that I mentioned really learned something over time, both through practice and evolution and through more detailed analysis, so that when the Constitution in the United States is implemented in 1789, it actually tends to work. There are big unintended consequences, but it still becomes a stable system.
Well, I think the other lesson, from what you've been saying there, and actually all the problems that you've been discussing through this podcast, is the importance of bringing an understanding of political phenomena as well as economics closer together. Thinking about the rent creation problem, the way we understand institutions, the way we understand markets, requires actually that politics and economics are understood in an integrated way. They're not seen to be separate.
Right.
And that's very much the vision at the heart of CSGS and the Department of Political Economy here at King's. So we've been really delighted to host you, Barry, and thank you very much for all the insights you provided, both in this podcast and over the last few days here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a great pleasure to be here and to see all the energy and excitement that exists here in terms of this. And I look forward to seeing you become a major player in the political economy and over the coming decades.
Thank you very much indeed.